And the first thing I like to do is check and be sure we're recording. So this is
Right.
Chris Payton. Today is September 28th,
Yes.
2001. I'm with Nancy Gerard and her husband in Savannah. Okay, the first question that we ask most people is, how are you related to Johnny Mercer? How did you know him?
I am the daughter of his sister, Juliana Mercer. And my maiden name was Nancy Mercer Keith. So he was my uncle
Mm-hmm.
and also my godfather.
And your father's name was?
And my father's name was Henry Gilbert Keith.
Great. How much direct contact did you have with him? How much, direct part of your life?
I had a lot of contact with him because I grew up in the house on Gwinnett Street. My grandmother, my mother, and I lived in that house. And when he came to Savannah, he would come to that house. And he came frequently. Probably once or twice a year I would see him. I was his goddaughter, so when he would phone, I also would speak with him. He always sent me gifts and birthdays. He was very much a part of my life. My parents were divorced when I was an infant, and he took on some of that part of what a father would have done. He provided braces for me, a private school for me, gave me a wonderful debutante party, sent me to college, gave me away at my second marriage to Steve Gerard.
Not to be nosy, what year were you born?
I
So
was
that we can
born
put this
December the 24th, 1940.
Okay.
1 month after my grandfather, his father, died.
So he was living out on the West Coast and well established in his career
Yes.
by this
Yeah.
time.
Mhm.
What kind of relationship was there between Johnny and your mother, his sister?
A very, very close relationship, a very protective relationship, and a very kind relationship. He gave her everything she needed. He always provided us with cars, homes, trips, gifts, attention. He was a very loyal son, brother, uncle, friend.
Did your mother have any stories about growing up with him? Did she have memories that she passed on to you?
She didn't tell me so many, but my grandmother told me many stories. My grandmother actually was the more active caregiver of me. And my grandmother would tell me stories of him. And one story she told me was the little card I showed you about the lily.
Yeah, the Easter
The
lily.
Easter
a
lily.
gift card from an Easter lily.
And he was a small boy then, probably 6, 7, or 8. And this is what she said to me. Bubba came up to me one day and said, "Mother, are there some jobs I could do around the house where I could earn some money?" And so she gave him some jobs, and he earned that money, and he ran running out, and then came back later with this lily that was sort of flopping and falling over, and gave it to her for Easter. He was always very, very attentive to his mother. Called her darling, and his precious darling. It's told, and you probably already know this, that my grandmother's sister Hattie, Aunt Hattie, tells a story that, I'm going to say Uncle Bubba because that's what I called him, that he hummed music when he was about 6 months old on her shoulders and on my grandmother's shoulders. And I'm not surprised at that. I had one myself that sort of sang when he was months old in the crib. I know they do that. I guess music was always a huge part of his life, and there are many, many stories of him chasing down the Daddy Grace parades, going over to the black churches and the black movie theaters, and at Pinpoint where the oysters would be shucked, and the black people who at that time were working in the oyster shucking place would sing as they did it, and he and Walter Rivers, his cousin, would go over there and listen, and they'd be gone for hours. And Johnny grew up with a lot of young black playmates. In those days it was perfectly acceptable for black and white children to play together until they got to be about 13 or 14. And Uncle Bubba had a lot of black companions, especially when they would go out to Vernon View.
What are your memories? Do you have particular memories of times that you spent with him?
I have a lot of memories.
His visits. I know we might have to do this more than once.
We might have to do.
Is there a first one that comes to mind?
I'm trying to remember the first one, and this may have been a first one, or it may have been not a first one, but I remember one particular time we were sitting in the dining room right around that table there, having lunch, and in those days we ate dinner in the middle of the day, and we were eating. And I know I was a small child. I was probably about 5, so it might not be the first visit, but it was one. And the door opened, and he says, "Whoo!" And my grandmother jumped up, "Oh, Baba, is that you?" And he would just walk in. We didn't always expect him, and he would just walk in like he had just left the day before, or as though he were coming back from work, and it was still his home. You would think he still came home every night because it was so familiar and nothing had changed, and that's just the way it was. And of course then the world stopped, and it was all about Uncle Bubba, and we were all so thrilled to see him. But I think I remember an earlier time when he and Ginger and Mandy came. And I remember sitting in the dining room, and we sat at a small table, Mandy and I think it must have been a Christmas. And she was probably about 5, and so I might have been about 3.5. And I guess I didn't like my vegetables, but she said, "Eat your spinach, honey, it's good for you." And that was a big family tale that they tell about that. So I'm sure that was one of the earlier memories, and there were probably earlier times, but I just don't really recall them. And that one is mostly about that, sitting down at that dinner. But I guess Ginger and Johnny and my mother and my grandmother were probably sitting at the big table, and we were sitting at the little table, and that was before Jeff came. Mm-hmm. So I remember that.
Did they Christmas with you very much?
No, not too often. A few times. I think maybe every few years or so they would. And then there were times when he would just come for a visit, and he absolutely adored his friends and his brothers, and he always came on the train, never flew. And we'd see him off at the old Savannah train station. At that time, the trains backed into the train station still. And my Uncle Hugh would always go with us, and we'd be there right at the door of the car and Johnny would be up the step, and Hugh would say, "Well, maybe I'll ride with you till we get to Columbia, and then I'll come back," or whatever town, whatever. And I've forgotten the route of the train now, but where it would go. And actually, Hugh would come back a week later, having gone all the way to New York and spent a week with Johnny in New York. And that happened on more than one occasion. And,
really?
Oh, yeah. And so my Uncle Bubba was very kind to his brothers and adored them. And Hugh was the youngest of the 3 half-brothers. I think he was about, you know better than I probably, because I can't remember the dates of all their births, but I have a feeling he was about 9 years older than Johnny. And so they were closer in age, and he was very kind to him. So he would treat him often, to trips. And he would treat everyone to trips. He had my mother and grandmother all the time to New York or out to Palm Springs or to California. And sometimes when a show would open, he'd be working on something. They would come up for the opening, and I guess I was there for a couple of openings. I remember going to New York once. It was not the opening of a show, but I guess he was there on business, and I was about 13, and it was the first time I ever went to New York. And he stood in the opera line to get tickets for me for an hour. So he was a regular kind of a guy, and we always got tickets to everything, and he would take us around and take us to the wonderful restaurants. And later on, he liked to stay at this one called the Tuscany. It's a small hotel over on the east side of Park Avenue in the
30s.
In the 30s. And I remember one time we were there, or maybe it was one time at the Plaza. My memory is going to fail me now, but he stayed at the Plaza and he stayed at the Tuscany. And I can't remember which hotel it was. And I was a teenager by then. And Billy Wilder was coming over. And, I knew these names, but I was fascinated, I guess, in a way by my uncle's fame, but to me he was more of an uncle than a celebrity. And I didn't really focus in on that. I was just there visiting my uncle, who I absolutely adored, and we had a lot of things in common. We had fun together. And I remember it was either at one of those hotels, he told me Billy Wilder was coming over, and he told me who he was, and that I should be suitably impressed when he came in. So I think what that shows is how humbled he was by that man, and his humility, his native, inner humility, and how he wanted to be sure that I paid the proper respect to this great person. That's just a little insight in my interpretation of his character.
And did you?
Yes, of course. I did everything Uncle Bubba told me to do. I always did. I always did what I was told, for the most part. Another time we were at, might have been Charlie O's in New York, next to the train station, the Grand Central, or we might have been at the Oyster Bar. I can't remember. He loved that. And William B. Williams was sitting at a table by himself, and he was a great radio host, a great radio host, and he loved
DJ,
and he loved Johnny Mercer music, and he always played it in a New York station. And Uncle Bubba saw him, and it was just he and I, and he said, "There's William B. over there. I'm going to stop by and say hello to him on the way out, because he's a great fan of mine, and he's very kind to me. He plays my pieces." And that's another insight into that. I stayed one whole summer in California at Newport Beach. When the summer I was 13, I believe, or I was 12 and a half, I guess it was 1953 or so. And Ginger's nephew, Johnny Hall, also came out. So it was Johnny Hall, me, Mandy, and Jeff was about 8 or 9 years old. And I stayed that whole summer. And we had a lot of fun going to the beach. And the Obers were there, and we played with the Obers. Uncle Bubba took me to a ballet at the Hollywood, is it called the Hollywood Bowl? The outdoor theater. And just he and I. And we sat right behind Leslie Caron and Danny Kaye. And that was wonderful. I was introduced. That was the summer he was writing Seven Brides for Seven Brothers with Jean DePaul at MGM Studio. And I went one day with him to the studio. He took me in, and I was starting to be a little awed by it, but he was still mostly my uncle. And it was a lovely studio. It was like a living room with a grand piano and a fireplace and cocktail tables and upholstered armchairs and wing chairs. And I curled up over in one of the wing chairs, and he said, you know, we're going to be busy. We're going to do a little bit of work, and then I'll take you to lunch. I said, okay. So I was listening to him write these lyrics. I think they were doing Love in a Home. I think that was what it was. I might be confused on that. Sometime around 3 o'clock, he turned to me and he said, I guess you're getting hungry, aren't you? Is it time for lunch? And that was at 3 o'clock, which it just speaks to the ability of those men able to focus, their focusing ability, and to shut out the world. And he always had that ability. He did that all the time. He was a little absent-minded at some things too. There was a time he threw a huge royalty check into the fireplace. I don't know if you know that story.
No, I don't.
Yes, there are things like that. And there are things about sending checks, big checks, and not signing them, forgetting to sign them.
Yeah, we'd heard something
about that.
The Chatham,
yeah,
the bank.
The bank, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, things like that. So he was not great with money. It wasn't a big important thing to him, and he was not a great businessman, but he was incredibly kind, sensitive, and sometimes soulful person.
How did the family, he took a career path that was radically different from the other members of his generation and
He did.
previous.
He did,
How
I
did
believe he-
people in the family view that to your knowledge?
I don't really know very much about that part. I think he had probably been registered and expected to go to Princeton and follow in those footsteps, but then my grandfather had that trouble when Uncle Bubba was in his senior year at Woodbury Forest School, and so he came home, and I believe he tried to work around the office a little bit, but it just wasn't his bent, and I don't know that I've never heard of any tension about that or anything other than normal acceptance. He just did his thing, and he went off and he made it. By the time I came along, I was born in the 40s, and I guess I had awareness by about 44, 45, and recall listening to him on the radio and the great excitement when he would come to town, and so I always knew there was something incredibly special about him. But generally, I don't think there was ever anything other than acceptance and awe and amusement and amazement and respect and about the whole thing.
You mentioned to me that your mother had an excellent voice.
My mother had an excellent voice. They both sang in choirs. It's told he sang at St. John's Choir, but I know they were a member of Christ Church, so I need to find a little bit more about that. My uncle sent my mother to Juilliard when she was probably 18 or 19 years old, and she studied voice there. She found it.
Which Uncle Johnny?
Uncle Bubba Johnny.
Uncle Bubby.
Uncle Bubba Johnny.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think she had a hard time living in New York on her own, and so did not complete the studies there. But she remained in the choir at Christ Church for probably 50 years, and occasionally sang solo. She had a beautiful soprano voice. And
How long did she stay at Juilliard?
probably a year.
So probably one academic term.
Probably an academic term, yeah. She knew every one of her brother's songs, and even a few days before she died, I could sing to her part of any lyric of any song, and she would fill in the words. I would say something like, "Oh, you met someone who set you back," and she would say, "On your heels." Or I would go, dream when you're feeling, and she'd say blue. Or I could even do the Girlfriend of the Whirling Dervish, and she could do that. Or I could do Tangerine, or some of those that are less well known, and she could always fill in. So she adored him and thought he was absolutely wonderful, and they were both so musical, and I'm sure they sang together. I used to sing with him a lot. We used to do a lot of bebopping and scatting around and singing, and when we would just be driving around, you know.
Well, didn't you say that a lot of his music or his ability came through his mother?
I thought it did. I thought, for a long time, I thought most of it came through there, but lately, since I've had a little more time to think about things and hear more stories and speak to Jean Lees and to other people, I'm thinking that it was just the right combination. Because I know that my grandfather loved all those popular parlor songs, and they sat around the fire and sang all the time. But my grandmother was very sensitive and loved music to the point of the emotional love that people have for music. And I believe that was the kind of intensity that Uncle Bubba had. And my grandmother told me when she grew up, they lived on this farm about 5 miles outside of Savannah on the Augusta Road, and it used to be called the 5 Mile Bend. And it's where the trains would back up, turn around to back up to go into the Savannah station. And my grandmother always thought that the sound of the train whistle was so lonesome and so mournful. And she would say to me, she would tell me this story. She rocked me a lot, and she would hold me, and I can remember being in her arms in the rocking chair, and she would say how the whistle went. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And I could still hear her saying it. I know she told the same stories to him. She had to have. And I just think that's where Blues in the Night came from. That's my personal feeling about it. You know, someone else may know more about it, but I believe that's where it came from. And so my grandmother had that kind of melancholia that, I'm not saying she was depressed, that's not what I'm saying, not a clinical depression, but that sort of quality that he had. He kind of had that quality. I sort of have it. Some of us in the family have that. And it's that, and he said to me on more than one occasion, he never felt he really got where he wanted to get. And I don't know if he was really talking about the fact that he never had the long-running Broadway hit. That certainly was part of it, but he just felt like he never reached where he wanted to reach. And I guess that's one of the things that drove him.
Were there other musical, if you branch out kind of sideways or down through the family, on either side, Mercer or Chuchevich, were there other folks that kind of showed tendencies in a similar direction? Or theatrical?
There are other people. David Chuchevich Jr., who is would be a, let's see, his father would be Johnny Mercer's first cousin. He is a very talented classical clarinetist, and he plays in Colorado Symphony. He is about 30-something. I have a musical talent, a singing and dancing musical talent. Strangely enough, I was never given music lessons, even though I begged for it. I tried to give them to myself later on in years, and I guess life had taken over, and I was impatient and silly. All of my children are incredibly musical. Lillian and Stephen Gerard, who are children from my marriage with Steve Gerard, are very musical, and it's because of Uncle Bubba that they were given music at an early age. They started on the Suzuki violin program. Lillian actually was good enough to be concert mistress at the high school program at Tanglewood and to be accepted into Juilliard and Manhattan School of Music and the University of Michigan music program. Stephen was accepted to NYU in the music program, and he has a degree in music technology, and he's a really wonderful string player. He plays mostly guitar now, but he also studied violin and viola, played 5-string electric violin, jazz violin. He plays guitar, acoustic and electric, teaches theory and guitar lessons, and plays around. I have another son from before I married Steve Gerard. His name is David Schools. He is in a very popular rock band called Widespread Panic. He's a bass player, and he's very, very gifted. He also does other kinds of producing and musical projects other than this rock group. I know that one of George and Betty Mercer's children, this would be George Mercer III, one of their children sings and plays, and Pierce Hammond, his mother would be Elizabeth Mercer. That would be George Mercer III's sister, and George Jr. His daughter sings and plays. So indeed the music seems to be coming out on both sides in the younger generations, I mean.
Did you have much contact with your Uncle Bubba later in his life, towards the very end of his life?
Yes, I did. When I married Steve Gerard, we lived in New York, and
When
later
was that?
we were married in '69,
Okay.
and from then on until last year, which would be 2000, we lived in New York or New Jersey, in the New York metropolitan area. And when Uncle Bubba would visit, or when he and Aunt Ginger would visit, we always got together. He would take us out to restaurants. He would come to our home. I would visit him. He would see my children. They would be together. He would get tickets for me to things. We would spend time together. He was kind to me and my children. The last time I saw him, he had come back from England. That's where the, I guess, tumor was discovered, when he fell trying to jump onto the tram.
Let me flip the tape so I don't lose this. Okay, you were telling about
I
when he came back
was
from...
telling when he came back from England. I guess he was working with Andre Previn
Mhm.
then on the Good Companions. And he came back. I knew he had had the fall. I did not know about the tumor at that time, but I knew that people were worried that there was something that had to be looked into. He called me, and I knew it was he, but his voice was greatly changed. And at that moment, I knew that there was something horribly wrong.
What did his voice, how did it sound
His
different?
voice, he didn't have that sort of squeaky personality, Savannah, Southern quality in it. I knew it was he. I've always known his voice. I would know it today if he called me. There was like a film.
Mhm.
That's all I can say, is that, that it was muffled or something in a way. It just was not right. We went in to see him. I took the children. We had some fun times. Then we went in another time during those few days when he was in New York before he went back to California. It was probably in August. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but I know it was in the summer. And my husband Steve, was it young Hugh? And he took us to dinner, and we went to our favorite restaurant called Palm in New York, where they have these 5-pound lobsters and these big steaks. I think it was the four of us. I believe so, because I was walking with Hugh and my husband Steve was walking with Uncle Bubba. And it was very hard for him to walk. He was sort of staggering. A lot of people thought that he was drinking in those last days, but he really wasn't. He just, I guess the tumor had affected his vestibular system and the quality of his movement, his coordination. So we went to this restaurant to eat, and I noticed that while he chewed his food, he wasn't able to swallow it, and that he very discreetly put it in his napkin. And we went back. This was when he had the apartment on, was it 92nd Street? No, 96th Street by the Armory, up on the Upper East Side, off Lexington. That was the last time I saw him. And then, of course, we talked a few times before he had the surgery. There was another time before all of this illness happened that we were in New York and at his apartment, and Marvin Hamlish came over. And I think they were going to work on a song, or they were beginning to work on a song. I've forgotten what it was. And I asked him to play something. He said, "Oh, I can't play any of my songs in this apartment. This is, remember that? Were you there with me?" No. And I had his autograph somewhere, but he was, in the same way that my Uncle Bubba had been in awe of other people, I saw the same thing coming from Marvin Hamlish to him.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the best times we had was when Steve and I got married, and that was in April of '69, and we were married in New York, and we had a wedding up in the top of a big building at a businessman's club. We were going on a cruise on the Greek line, and my husband was a maritime attorney, and one of his clients was Greek line, and we had this reception. The whole reception moved to the ship. Uncle Bubba, by the way, had given me away at that wedding. He stood up for me. And then we had an accordion player who came with us to the ship, and the whole reception moved to the ship. And I'm going to let Steve tell the rest of this story.
Well, the owner of the line had given us a separate room that we could use for our guests. And as we came onto the ship, the band leader, and they had a pretty big band, and I knew him pretty well. I saw Johnny, and he came over to me and said, would Johnny like us to move our band into your room? And Johnny said, no, that would really be insulting to the accordionist that your father, hired. And that's the way he was. He had a lot of respect for other musicians. But he was really a very, very nice person, and I wish I had known him longer, but we were married in '69 and he died in '76. So I really
And your
didn't-
children were born before or after he died?
Let's see, Lillian was born in 1970 and Steve in '74. So both of them, were born before he died.
And did he have a chance to meet them? And
Oh,
I
yeah.
have
children.
pictures up there. Remember I showed you on?
right.
Yeah, and he's, I have some photographs of Uncle Bubba at the New York apartment with Lillian and Stevie and me, and also my mother. And it was that when he came back from France, I guess, working with Michel Legrand, and he impressed on me how important it was to give your children music lessons, since he wasn't an accomplished player by any means. He said that Michel Legrand took each of his sons an hour a day and worked with them on the piano, and that I should, give my children music lessons. And so at the age of 2.5, Stephen and Lillian of 5.5 or so started the Suzuki violin program, and it's because of him that they are so accomplished in their music. Lillian actually went to Juilliard, but she decided not to pursue her career professionally in music. And Stephen went to the University of New York in Manhattan, and has a degree in music technology. And he teaches theory, music on stringed instruments, predominantly the guitar now, and is pursuing another degree, this time in physics. But he does a lot of composing and working with popular bands and music.
Got a little different question. When Johnny Mercer married, he didn't marry a Savannah girl.
No.
He married someone from New York,
Yes.
from the theater.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense, I mean, this was obviously way before your time, but do you have any sense how that merger worked of this Savannah family, and did any of the other brothers choose wives that were from vastly different
No.
regions or backgrounds?
No, they didn't. George chose Bessie Wheelis, who was from an aristocratic Southern family. Walter and Hugh each married sisters, Southern sisters. And Johnny married a showgirl. And I do know the story that I guess my grandmother, when she met her, my Aunt Ginger said something about she didn't know how to cook. And my grandmother said, well, don't learn.
Oh, really?
I never ever got from my grandmother any sense that she did not completely accept Aunt Ginger. I never heard anything negative about her from my grandmother. But I do know that there was some sense that Ginger was not comfortable here in Savannah. There may have been some acceptance problems from some other family members or some friends. I'm not sure exactly. There is lore. I remember this, something about a thank you note not being written in a timely fashion. I don't really know. You may have heard that before.
No.
I just, I'm not sure about that.
That Ginger didn't
Yes,
write back.
yes, but I know if I didn't write my thank you note to her within a week, I heard about it. So I don't really know,
Okay. Just thought I'd ask.
Mm-mm.
I think that's all I have for this time.
Okay.
Do you have any additional memories that you want?
Well, we used to go out, sometimes riding around, and we'd go out in the country and on Sunday and sort of park where we could hear the church music going on in the black communities.
This is you
Me and Uncle Bubba.
Oh, the two of you. Okay.
Mhm. We did a lot of things together,
You did.
just he and I. I don't know, I guess he liked me. He liked me, he loved me. And he was just very, very kind to me. I don't know, did I get it on the tape where I said what I told you before about putting me through college?
I think you mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
And that I said I wanted to pay him back.
No,
I don't think that's on the tape. Let me tell you that, because
Sure.
I think that's a wonderful story. I went back to college after I already had been married and divorced and had a child, and it was very hard. I was working and going to school, and it got to be very difficult. I guess my grandmother asked if he could help me, and he supported me through about 3 years of living in Richmond, Virginia, and going to it was called Richmond Professional Institute. Now it's called Virginia Commonwealth University, and I received a degree in occupational therapy. He sent me a telegram when I graduated, congratulating me. And then after I had graduated and gotten a job. The first job I got was at the Bronx VA Hospital in New York, and it was probably on one of those New York visits. We were together, and I said that, you know, I had the job now, I was making money, and that I wanted to start paying him back. And he said, absolutely not. You know, I don't want you to pay me back. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so thrilled that you've chosen this career and that you're going to be working with children. But what you can do for me is, when I'm down and out, will you pass the hat?
Mm-hmm.
So he was very generous. And I know that because he was generous to not only the family, but to his friends. One of my peers, and a girl who made her debut with me, was the daughter of one of his best friends. She had a horrible, horrible accident in her first or second year of college, and it left her permanently impaired, and they had to make like a little apartment for her out of their garage in their home. And this was a wealthy family, so this was not a money gift that was needed or a gift that was needed, but Uncle Bubba outfitted the whole place with music and records and entertainment, you know, for her. And that was one of his very best friends. And he always did things like that. You know, you didn't always know about it, but he helped people all the time. Mm-hmm. When that summer that I was out in California, they were running this show called, what was it called? Musical Chairs.
Mm-hmm.
And we would go see that when they were doing it. I believe when I saw it, it was Bobby Troup, Julie Christie, Stan Freberg, Johnny Mercer, and maybe one other person I can't quite remember. And Stan Freberg had this children's television show with puppets called Cecil the Seasick Sea Serpent. And he came out to visit us at Lido Isle, and he brought those puppets and gave us a show out there. And Jeff particularly liked that. Jeff was about 7 or 8 years old. And that was the year the Boy Scout Jamboree came out to the Irvine Ranch.
Mm-hmm.
And Mandy and I, and one other friend she had from Lido Isle, went out to that Boy Scout Jamboree, and some fellows from Savannah were there, so Uncle Bubba took us out, and we went to see them, and we stayed there, and that was huge. I guess Mandy's friend was driving, because we were with her, and we didn't get back until really late, about 10 or 10:30 at night, and Aunt Ginger let us have it, because we were so late getting
They were
back.
worried.
They were worried, yeah. Mhm. But Uncle Bubba would take us swimming, and we'd go out on the paddle boards, and he was just a regular guy, you know, a father doing his fatherly things and his uncly things, and it was just a family man, a regular man
That kind of a weird
with
question.
his genius.
What color were his eyes?
They were blue like my grandmother's,
Were they?
bluish green. Probably mine.
Yours are blue.
Kind of like mine.
Okay.
My grandmother's eyes were more
We get
blue
this
than
question,
mine.
and they don't show in the photographs, and it just occurred to me that
Mhm.
we should ask the family
The,
member.
most of the Mercers are blonde and sort of fair and blue-eyed and not particularly tall. Average height or less than average height.
Okay.
I have one story
Sure.
to
Good.
show how other people who were really big in show business, how they felt about Johnny. But we had the pleasure of watching him do his one-man show at the 92nd Street Y in their Lyricist series. And that was absolutely marvelous. And of course, I didn't know anybody in show business. I had never been exposed to show business. But, you know, I have a good memory for faces, and I saw Zero Mostel sitting in the audience. And afterward, we're walking out in the street, and I went up to Zero Mostel and said, Mr. Mostel, my wife is Johnny's niece. Could you give me your autograph? And I had the playbill, which was specially done for this show, and it had Johnny's picture on the front. And I handed it to him, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, I can't sign on the same side as Johnny." And he turned it over and signed on the back. And I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it just showed the respect that he had, for Johnny.
Here's one other story that I like to tell because it cracks me up so much. We were sitting on Johnny, Uncle Bubba and I were sitting on the front steps of the 49th Street house. And I think it was around Christmas time. It was one of those Christmases. And Steve was inside the house, and the phone rings, and a second or two later, Steve, my husband, comes to the door and says, "Johnny, the phone's for you." And he says, "Well, who is it?" And Steve says, "Well, it's the White House." And Uncle Bubba didn't think he was telling the truth. He thought he was just making a joke, "Oh, you're kidding." No, it really is the White House. "Oh, okay." So he gets on the phone, and it was someone from the musical archives, maybe connected with the Smithsonian or something like that, and they wanted Uncle Bubba to help them with the collection of American songs. Mm-hmm. And I remember I heard his side of the conversation, and he said, "Are you sure you want me? I'm not sure I'm the best man for the job." So he was always very humble, and I don't know if he really thought he was as, I just don't know what he thought,
Mm-hmm.
Hard to know, but there were so many instances of that where he was so humble. Mm. You remember that?
I sure do. My hands are still shaking.
Yeah. And then the time we had the debutante party, probably Anne might have told you about that.
Different people had given me little bits, but
With
since you were
Christmas
actually
trees encased in ice.
no,
Big Christmas trees on the bar in blocks of ice, decorated, lighted Christmas trees in ice.
really.
And two bands.
Now there were 3 debutantes. Right.
Louise Mercer,
Right.
Amanda
That's
Mercer,
Louise Mercer's who's
Anne's sister, Walter Mercer's daughter,
Okay.
and me, Nancy.
Right.
The 3 cousins.
Right.
Yeah, and 2 bands.
2 bands. I had heard that.
Mhm.
Different bands. Too.
Different bands.
One was what, jazz?
Yeah, and one was the regular,
Just mainstream.
and one was from New York.
Mhm.
And those bands switched off, and that party never ended. In fact, they ended up serving us breakfast around 4. And those invitations came out as, I think, telegrams.
Really?
Or something like that. Yeah, something. Or one, I don't know if it was our party, but he also gave another party, and these invitations were telegrams.
Real telegrams.
Yeah.
Not
No,
invitations made up.
telegrams.
Real telegrams. Neat.
Mhm.
Was Savannah surprised by this kind of thing?
No. I don't think they were surprised. I think they just loved it.
Uh,
I don't think there were other celebrities, from Savannah.
right.
But I think
He appears to have had just this really specific style to himself there.
he had a very specific style.
With the parties and things.
Yeah,
so.
very specific style. Yeah. Yeah, we had fun. We did a lot of laughing, a lot of singing. There was a lot of drinking in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun.
It was fun. We had a lot of fun. And he gave other debutante parties for other people, separate from us too. He didn't
Oh, really?
always lump us all. I mean, he was nice. He
Non-relatives?
yeah,
Or were they all?
best friends' children or
Oh, really?
something like. Yeah, he did other things like that.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
He had a very large world, in some ways.
He did have a large world.
I mean, if, the normal family, you'd have your debutante party for.
We had all his friends that he grew up with and all his best friends that he remained best friends with. And so he did the appropriate things that Southerners do. Southerners give their best friends debutante parties or parties.
Okay.
And he did those things. And then, of course, he had his Hollywood friends and his New York friends and his, and had new friends.
Wonderful life.
Wonderful life. Just was a little short.
Sadly, but
Sadly short.
but very full.
Very full. He hated doctors. He was afraid of doctors. I think he put off having a hernia operation for about 10 or 15 years. I remember my grandmother listening to it on the radio, heard the news. Johnny Mercer went in for a hernia operation. She didn't even know about it because he tried not to worry her.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate the memories, and we'll have to do this again.
Yes, I'm sure other things will come to light.
They will.
You may have specific questions. I'll be happy to answer. And I'll try to find out who those people are. You can scan it better and
Yeah, in the
send it to me.
photographs.
I'd be glad to do that.
Great.